Welcome, and thank you for joining tonight's story. As you relax and let the day fade away, I'll take you into a world where gangsters and spies crossed paths, where crime and intelligence became one shadowy game. If you enjoy these calm stories, remember to gently subscribe and stay with us for more nights like this. Now, close your eyes, take a slow breath, and step with me into the hidden world of a gangster who lived between loyalty and betrayal. The city never truly slept, even when the streets were quiet. When the night softened the sharp edges of life, there were always hidden movements in the dark. The hum of traffic faded, but behind shuttered windows and dim alleyways, deals were being made, whispers were exchanged, and footsteps carried secrets no one wanted spoken aloud. It was in this half-light, this in-between world, that Vito Caruso was born. His story begins not with power, but with survival. Vito entered the world in the narrow streets of Brooklyn during the late 1920s, a time when America was still wrestling with prohibition, when liquor was outlawed and yet flowed more freely than water if you knew the right door to knock on. His family was poor, immigrants from southern Italy who carried little more than memories of their old village and the determination to carve out something better in a foreign land. His father worked long shifts at the docks, his hands torn and scarred from ropes and salt, while his mother tried to stretch every coin into bread and soup for the table. From the beginning, Vito understood that life was not fair. He saw men with polished shoes and new coats walk into the neighborhood taverns, while his own father coughed from the cold and carried home only a few crumpled bills. But young Vito also noticed something else. Those polished men were not bankers or factory owners. They were men who operated outside the rules, and yet they were respected, even feared. To a boy growing up with hunger gnawing at his stomach, that kind of power left an impression stronger than any sermon or school lesson. He was quiet as a child, observant. While others played stickball in the streets, Vito lingered at corners, watching who paid whom, who looked away, and who dared to look too long. He learned the rhythm of silence, the way to fade into a crowd, the patience of listening, and slowly people began to trust him with errands. First it was harmless, delivering a message, carrying a small envelope. But soon, those errands became more dangerous. Money, wagers, bottles of liquor that were not supposed to exist. He was only a teenager when he realized he had become a thread in the invisible web of the underworld. By the time Vito reached his 20s, the Great Depression had tightened its grip on the city. Jobs vanished, families were torn apart, but the underworld thrived. Gambling dens and speakeasies became sanctuaries for men who had lost everything. Caruso found himself moving deeper into this hidden economy. He became a fixer, a man who could arrange what others couldn't. If someone needed money, he found a lender. If a sailor wanted to sell something off the docks, Vito knew a buyer. His gift was not in violence, though he could defend himself if pressed, but in negotiation, in creating invisible bridges between people who had something and people who needed it. That skill did not go unnoticed. Older gangsters began to trust him with bigger responsibilities. Soon he had his own small crew, men who would move goods across the city, no questions asked. They weren't the flashiest operators, but they were reliable, and reliability was a rare treasure in a world of greed and betrayal. Vito's reputation grew quietly, like ivy climbing the side of a building, not loud but steady, wrapping itself into every crack of the neighborhood. It was during those years, in the late 1940s, that his path crossed with a different kind of shadow. The war had ended, the world was reshaped, and nations were beginning to fight battles not with tanks, but with secrets. Intelligence agencies, old and new, hunted for information, for smuggling routes, for ways to move people and things unseen. And in the chaos of post-war smuggling, the paths of spies and gangsters overlapped more often than anyone would admit. One evening, while overseeing a shipment on the docks, Vito noticed a man who was clearly out of place. He was dressed too clean, his shoes too polished for the dirty work of hauling crates. The man spoke softly, in clipped tones that carried authority. Later, Vito learned his name, though it was surely not his real one. He was called Mr. Alden, and he carried the kind of aura that suggested he could make problems vanish. He asked questions, not about money or gambling, but about ships, routes, and ports that rarely appeared on official maps. At first, Vito kept his distance. He had learned early that curiosity could be dangerous, but Mr. Alden was persistent, and more importantly, respectful. He didn't threaten, he didn't bribe. He simply laid out possibilities. If certain goods could move without notice, then perhaps people could as well. If a trusted crew could deliver packages discreetly, perhaps they could carry information or equipment. Vito realized, almost with surprise, that he was being tested, not by another gangster, but by someone from the shadow world of intelligence. The idea appealed to him, not for patriotism, not for loyalty to flag or nation, but for the same reason he had entered crime in the first place: survival and advantage. If he could be useful to people who had influence beyond the city, then he could shield himself from threats within it. In a life where betrayal lurked at every corner, a connection to power beyond the streets was priceless. So, slowly, carefully, Vito allowed himself to be drawn in. He began by offering simple favors, information about certain dock schedules, quiet assistance in slipping someone onto a ship unnoticed. The pay was modest, but the real reward came in protection. Cases that might have brought him before a judge suddenly disappeared. Police raids somehow missed his operations. Competitors who threatened him found themselves facing troubles of their own. The connection was invisible, but powerful. As years passed, Caruso's reputation shifted. To the underworld, he was a reliable boss who kept his crew disciplined and avoided unnecessary violence. To a small circle within the intelligence community, he was a useful asset, a man who understood discretion and logistics. He became a bridge between two worlds that pretended not to know each other, but relied on each other more than they would ever admit. But double lives are never simple. Each favor he granted pulled him deeper into a web, where one wrong step could unravel everything. He told himself it was temporary, just another hustle, another way to stay ahead. Yet in quiet moments, he wondered how much of his life still belonged to him, and how much was being written by unseen hands. He remembered one night in particular, sitting in a smoky back room of a club he owned. The music drifted from the main floor, soft jazz carrying over the hum of voices. Across the table sat Mr. Alden, his face calm, his eyes sharp. He placed a small envelope on the table, heavier than usual. "Consider this," Alden said softly, "an investment. There will be times when we ask more of you, times when your loyalty will matter. You have a choice, Vito. You can remain a man of the streets, or you can step into a larger world. Vito looked at the envelope, then at the man who had become both ally and shadow. He thought of his family, of the men who depended on him, of the enemies who would gladly see him fall. And though he said nothing in that moment, his silence was an answer. He had already stepped into that larger world, even if he hadn't admitted it to himself. The city outside kept moving, unaware of the quiet bargain being sealed. Taxi horns echoed, streetlights flickered, and the night air carried the scent of rain. But in that room, a gangster crossed an invisible line, binding himself to forces he could never fully control. From then on, his life was no longer just about money, power, or survival. It was about secrets, about balancing between two masters, about playing a game where the rules were written in shadows. And though he did not know it yet, every step deeper into that game would bring him closer to the edge where loyalty, betrayal, and fate all blurred into one. For now, though, he remained calm, steady, his voice low as he gave orders to his crew, his eyes always scanning the room, his ears tuned to whispers others ignored. To those around him, he was just another boss, another name in the long line of men who ruled the underworld. But in the quiet corners of the intelligence world, Vito Caruso's name was already written in files that would never be shown to the public. And as the night deepened, as the city sank into restless sleep, the man who was both gangster and something more leaned back in his chair, lit a cigarette, and exhaled slowly. In the smoke curling upward, the shape of his future seemed to twist and disappear, as mysterious as the world he was now part of. The years slipped forward like smoke drifting from a match, curling and twisting until one could no longer see where the flame had begun. For Vito Caruso, life in the city was steady on the surface, but beneath that calm, a deeper current pulled him into places he had once sworn he would never step. The nightclub he owned sparkled with laughter, music, and clinking glasses. But behind closed doors, the conversations were softer, more deliberate, and often carried more weight than any deal struck on the streets. The late 1940s became the early 1950s, and the Cold War was tightening its grip on the world. Invisible lines divided nations, and governments fought not just with armies, but with whispers and shadows. Intelligence agencies sought not only information, but also people who could move unseen through the cracks of society. In that search, they found men like Vito, men who were not bound by official rules, but who understood the language of secrecy. Vito's partnership with Meister Alden deepened quietly. There were no contracts, no signatures, only silent understandings. His docks, his men, his routes, they became more than just channels for contraband. They became arteries through which secrets could flow. Sometimes it was a small crate, no markings, no questions. Other times it was a passenger, slipping through unnoticed, vanishing into the city like a ghost. Vito never asked names. He never asked destinations. He only ensured discretion, and in return, he received something rarer than money: protection. Word spread in hushed tones. Lawmen seemed hesitant to touch Caruso. Cases dissolved, raids arrived too late, and rivals who pushed too close found themselves tangled in problems far larger than neighborhood disputes. Some believed he had bought off half the police. Others whispered that he had friends in Washington. Both were true in their own way, though the reality was more subtle. He had become useful, and usefulness was the most valuable currency in the hidden world. Still, usefulness came with danger. The more valuable he became, the more others wanted to know what he was hiding. His own men, loyal though they seemed, sometimes wondered why their boss could walk untouched where others fell. A few asked too many questions. Those questions never spread far, but each time it happened, Vito felt the tightening of a noose only he could see. In those days, his nights grew longer. He would sit in his office above the club, the air heavy with smoke, his glass of whiskey untouched, listening to the music drifting upward. Jazz and blues, voices rising and falling, blending into the rhythm of the city's pulse. He thought of the deals he had made, the paths he had chosen. He told himself he was still a gangster, still his own man. But he knew, in the silence between notes, that he was also something else now. An instrument being played by hands he could not see. One evening, Mr. Alden returned, his presence as calm and deliberate as always. This time, he brought another man with him. The stranger spoke little, his accent faintly foreign, his gaze sharp and cold. Vito understood without words that this was no ordinary contact. The stranger was from overseas, perhaps from London, perhaps from elsewhere. The agencies that hunted in shadows did not confine themselves to borders. They reached across oceans, building networks that no newspaper would ever print. Alden explained, with his usual quiet precision, that certain movements were becoming difficult. The world was watching Havana more closely, and routes into Cuba needed to be secured. Ships could no longer be trusted without men who understood discretion. Vito's ships, his men, his silence, these were valuable. "It is not about money anymore," Alden said softly, his fingers tapping the table as though marking time. "It is about trust and timing. You will help us, and in return, you will remain protected." Vito nodded slowly, though inside he weighed the balance of risk. Cuba was hot, too hot. Rumors of revolution swirled, and foreign interests clashed in the streets of Havana. Yet refusing was not an option. He had already stepped too far to retreat. Each favor bound him tighter. Each task became another link in a chain that wrapped invisibly around him. That night, long after Alden and the stranger had gone, Vito walked the streets alone. The rain had fallen earlier, leaving the pavement slick and shimmering beneath the streetlights. His shoes clicked softly as he moved past shuttered shops and the occasional late-night diner. He thought of his father, the dock worker who had dreamed only of steady wages. Would the old man have understood the choices his son had made? Would he have seen them as survival or as betrayal? Vito's thoughts lingered on those questions, but answers never came. The city gave none. The missions grew more complex. Sometimes it was equipment, strange machines packed into crates, heavy and silent. Sometimes it was men, strangers with eyes that never rested, carried quietly through the night. Vito's crew did not know details. He ensured they never asked. To them, it was just another job, another favor for their boss. But Vito knew better. Each delivery, each quiet crossing, was a thread in a much larger tapestry, one that stretched far beyond Brooklyn, far beyond New York, across oceans and continents. There were moments when he glimpsed the scale of it. A newspaper headline about a spy arrested in Europe, and he would remember the pale face of a man he had helped board a ship weeks earlier. A radio broadcast about tension in Havana, and he would recall the crates that had left his docks under cover of night. These connections were never spoken, but in his mind, they formed a pattern, subtle but undeniable. He was part of something vast, though he was only a shadow on the edge of it. Yet shadows attract other shadows. In time, rivals began to notice. Another gangster, eager to expand his influence, hinted that Caruso was protected in ways no ordinary man could be. Whispers spread, dangerous whispers, that perhaps Vito was not just a gangster, but a traitor to his own kind. Betrayal was the ugliest word in that world, heavier than murder, sharper than death. And though none dared accuse him openly, Vito felt the eyes watching, the silence in conversations that once had flowed easily. He adjusted, as he always had. He spoke less, listened more. He moved carefully, keeping his crew loyal through quiet generosity. He reminded them that as long as they stayed close, they would be safe, paid, and protected. And for most, that was enough. But trust, once cracked, never fully mends. He knew this, and he carried the weight of it in every step. One late night, sitting alone in his office, he opened a drawer and pulled out an old photograph. It was faded, the edges curled with time. His mother, his father, himself as a boy standing between them. They had believed in hard work, in honesty, in a future built with calloused hands. He wondered what they would think now, of a son who dealt in shadows, who bargained with men whose names would never be known. The music from the club below drifted upward again, soft and soothing, like a lullaby for the restless. Vito leaned back, exhaled slowly, and let the smoke from his cigarette rise into the dim light. He told himself he was still in control, still steering his own fate. But somewhere deep within, he knew that the web around him was tightening, that each choice pulled him further from the boy in that photograph. The city outside was alive, restless, unknowing. Lights blinked, taxis rushed past, voices echoed in the night. And within that endless rhythm, Vito Caruso sat alone, a man divided. Gangster to some, collaborator to others, a player in a game whose rules were written in silence. His story was far from over, but already the shadows were thickening, and the line between loyalty and betrayal was fading into the night. Den Nauwis and Dote. The city never stopped breathing. Even in the quietest hours when most windows were dark and only a few lamps burned against the night, there was always a hum beneath the silence. A train in the distance, the faint roll of tires on wet pavement, a voice drifting from a bar that stayed open too late. For men like Vito Caruso, that constant pulse was a reminder. The city was alive, always watching, always listening. By the mid-1950s, Vito's world had grown heavier, more intricate. He had money, more than he could ever spend in a lifetime. He had respect, even fear, for men who would not dare cross him openly. And he had something rarer still, protection from invisible hands that reached far beyond New York. Yet with every advantage came a shadow, and with every favor granted to those hidden agencies, the shadows thickened around him. He sat often in the back room of his club, staring at the smoke curling from his cigarette, watching it twist and vanish. That smoke reminded him of his own life, substantial for a moment, then gone without a trace. He told himself he was still just a gangster, still in charge of his choices, but the quiet truth whispered otherwise. He had become a piece on someone else's board, moved by decisions made in offices he would never see. The requests from his intelligence contacts grew bolder, no longer just crates and passengers. Now there were questions of influence, of information. A man would ask casually whether a certain politician in New York had been seen in a club, whether a union leader could be leaned on, whether a rival gangster had ties to foreign hands. Vito realized he was not only moving goods, he was moving knowledge, steering currents that reached far beyond the docks. And with knowledge came danger. Rivals noticed his silence, his calm refusal to be drawn into petty fights. Some mistook it for weakness. Others sensed something else, something unspoken. Whispers spread that Caruso was untouchable not because of strength, but because of something darker, something hidden. In smoky bars and dim alleys, men began to say his name more carefully, unsure whether he was one of them or something entirely different. Vito, ever watchful, noticed the change. Eyes lingered too long. Conversation stopped when he entered the room. He understood what they were thinking. Betrayal. The word hung in the air like a blade, and though no one dared speak it to his face, he felt it cut deeper with every passing night. Still, he carried on. He met with Alden, the man who had first opened the door to this double life. Alden's calm voice never changed, his words measured, his gaze steady. "You are becoming important to us," he said, one night, sliding a folder across the table. Inside were photographs, grainy images of men standing in Havana, of ships on the horizon, of faces Vito did not know. "Your cooperation will ensure these men never trouble you, but you must remain careful. There are those watching." Vito looked at the photographs without comment. He knew what Alden was saying without words. The agencies trusted him, but not fully. Trust in their world was never complete. He was useful, but usefulness could vanish in a heartbeat. He closed the folder, slid it back across the table, and gave a slow nod. "Careful," he repeated quietly. "Always." That night, as he left the meeting, he felt the weight of unseen eyes on him. He could not prove it, but he knew. Someone was following. Someone was measuring his steps. In the reflections of shop windows, in the shuffle of footsteps a block behind, he sensed the gaze of men who wanted to know more than he wished to show. He did not confront them. He simply adjusted his pace, ducked into an alley, and disappeared through a side door into one of his clubs. The shadows closed behind him, but the unease did not fade. In moments like these, Vito thought often of his mother. She had once told him, long ago, that the world was filled with two kinds of silence: the silence of peace and the silence of danger. He carried those words with him always, and lately, every silence felt like danger. He began to notice cracks even within his crew. A young man named Angelo, loyal on the surface, started asking questions about shipments that arrived without explanation. Another, Salvatore, seemed nervous when strangers passed through the docks. They were good men, but curiosity was poison in their world. Vito handled it as he always did, with calm. He spoke to them softly, reassured them, gave them small bonuses, reminded them of loyalty, yet in his mind he marked their names. In his world, doubt could not be allowed to grow. Weeks later, Angelo vanished. Some said he had run off with a girl, others whispered he had been caught stealing. Vito never confirmed either story. He only ensured the whispers did not spread too far. His crew learned again what they had always known: questions could be more dangerous than bullets. But the questions never ended. Outside his circle, rivals pressed harder. A gangster named DeLuca began moving into territories near Vito's docks. He was brash, reckless, and eager to prove himself. One night, in a crowded bar, DeLuca hinted loudly that Caruso's strength came from more than muscle. "Funny how some men never get raided," he said, his voice carrying over the music. "Funny how some always know when to step aside. Maybe they're not so much gangsters as informants." The word hung heavy. Informant. Betrayer. Rat. No one laughed. No one replied. But the seed had been planted. Vito heard of it within hours, as he always did. He did not respond, not openly. But the next week, DeLuca's car was found abandoned near the river. No body was ever recovered. The city moved on, but the whispers did not. In the quiet that followed, Vito spent long nights staring out his office window at the lights of the city. He wondered how much longer he could balance on the edge of two worlds. To the gangsters, he was already suspicious. To the agencies, he was valuable but never trusted. He existed in a narrow space between loyalty and betrayal, a space that could vanish in an instant. Still, he moved carefully. He continued to deliver, to provide routes, to keep silent. His clubs thrived, his men remained loyal, and his name carried weight. Yet deep inside, he knew the end was already written. Men like him did not retire, did not fade into comfort. They burned until someone, somewhere, decided their usefulness had ended. One evening he walked alone along the East River. The water lapped quietly against the piers, the air cool with the scent of salt and iron. He thought of his father again, of the dock work that had broken the old man's hands. He thought of his mother's warnings, of her prayers whispered in a language he barely remembered. And he thought of himself, standing now in silence, a man both powerful and powerless, a man whose fate belonged as much to shadows as to his own will. The river carried no answers. It only reflected the city lights, trembling across the surface, vanishing into the night. Vito lit another cigarette, inhaled deeply, and exhaled into the cold air. He told himself he would endure, as he always had. But in the stillness, in the soft echo of water against stone, he felt the whisper of truth. The double game could not last forever. And somewhere, beyond the reach of his gaze, men were already deciding how it would end. The nights in New York grew colder as winter crept closer, wrapping the city in a quiet frost that seemed to settle not only on rooftops and streets, but on the hearts of those who walked its alleys. Vito Caruso felt it first in the silence, in the spaces where once there had been easy movement. The streets hummed, yes, but there was a subtle tension now, a pulse beneath the ordinary noise that reminded him that nothing stayed hidden forever. By this time, the dual life he had built was no longer just a secret. It had become a living, breathing force. His nightclub thrived, filled with music and laughter that masked the weight of his real work. His crew remained loyal, though he always kept one eye on them, for the smallest hesitation could blossom into disaster. And above all, his intelligence contacts demanded more. No longer were they asking for simple favors or quiet assistance. Now they needed decisions, influence, and information that stretched beyond the city, touching foreign ports and foreign governments. Vito had learned to handle these requests with the same patience he had always applied to the streets. He never rushed. He never panicked. He measured each choice, weighing risks against rewards in a careful balance. And yet, for the first time in years, he felt uncertainty creep into his chest. The line between his world and theirs was thinning, and he knew that any misstep could be fatal. It began with small things: packages delayed, a shipment that never arrived, a crew member who disappeared without explanation. At first he dismissed them as accidents, the natural chaos of business. But when the mistakes multiplied, and when whispers of betrayal reached his ears, he knew that the shadows had grown teeth. Someone was testing him, probing his limits, perhaps trying to find a weakness that could be exploited. A meeting with Alden confirmed his fears. The man arrived quietly one evening, his suit pressed, his posture calm, but his eyes sharper than usual. He handed Vito a folder, thick and heavy, with photographs and notes. The images showed ships, documents, and men, some of whom Vito had assisted, others unknown to him. "Errors have been made," Alden said softly, almost too soft. "We need to know why. You understand, Vito, that mistakes in our line of work are rarely forgiven." Vito's heart did not race. He did not show panic, but inside a cold knot formed. The mistakes had not been his fault, but someone in the network had decided to test him, to see how far they could push. The realization was heavy. Even the invisible hands that had protected him were not infallible. The world he had once believed he could navigate with ease was now threatening to collapse around him. He spent the next days carefully retracing movements, questioning his crew without revealing his suspicions. Every action was deliberate, measured, a dance of shadows that required the precision of a man who knew what was at stake. Slowly, piece by piece, he began to identify the weak links, the points where trust had been broken. Yet even as he corrected the course, he sensed that the real danger was not in mistakes, it was in perception. Men were beginning to watch him, to wonder how much of his loyalty was real, how much was performance. Then came the night that changed everything. Vito was overseeing a routine shipment along the docks when he noticed a man watching from the shadows. At first, it seemed like a harmless observer, someone curious about the activity at the pier. But there was a rhythm to the man's movements, a patience that suggested intent. Vito did not confront him. He only watched, moving with the quiet grace of a man who had learned that patience often revealed the truth. The man did not leave. Instead, he followed, always just out of sight, blending into the fog that rolled in from the river. Vito's instincts told him that this was no ordinary curiosity. Someone had come to measure him, to determine whether he was still reliable or whether he had become a liability. He knew then that the game had changed. The shadows that once protected him were now watching, testing, and judging. Over the next weeks, the tension grew. His crew sensed it too, though they could not articulate it. Whispers traveled faster than the cold winds along the piers, and Vito understood that loyalty alone would not save them. Influence, discretion, and timing would be the keys to survival. He became more deliberate in his movements, more secretive in his communications. Even in the comfort of his office, surrounded by familiar furniture and the soft glow of lamps, he felt the weight of unseen eyes. To noon. One evening, Alden returned with urgent news. The agencies had intercepted information suggesting that certain foreign powers were aware of Vito's involvement. It was unclear whether they understood the extent, but they had identified him as a point of interest, a node in a larger network. The warning was subtle, almost polite, but Vito recognized the unspoken truth. The very agencies that had once protected him were now telling him that he might be expendable. The realization was stark. He had long accepted that his life was intertwined with danger. But this was different. Now the threat was not just external, it was internal, embedded in the very network that had given him purpose and power. Vito understood that he could no longer rely solely on caution. He had to anticipate, to act with precision, to move before the shadows reached for him. He began to prepare. His clubs, once venues of simple profit, became staging grounds for surveillance and contingency. He mapped escape routes, secured safe houses, and instructed his most trusted men on signals and secret codes. Each measure was taken quietly, without alarm, with the calm demeanor of a man accustomed to danger. Yet beneath the calm, there was an undercurrent of urgency that he could not ignore. The nights were long, filled with quiet observation and careful planning. Vito watched as the city moved around him, the lights reflecting off wet pavement, the hum of traffic a constant reminder of life continuing despite unseen struggles. He reflected on his past decisions, the moments where choice had led him into this intricate web of power and peril. Every favor granted, every silence maintained, every risk calculated. They had all brought him to the edge of shadows where the next step could be the last. Then, the final test came. A shipment that had been scheduled for weeks arrived under unexpected conditions. Men he had never seen before appeared, asking questions, checking details, and probing for weaknesses. Vito stepped forward with the calm he had cultivated over decades. He greeted them politely, offered assistance, and observed every reaction with meticulous care. He answered questions without revealing the full scope of his knowledge, guided the process without appearing involved, and ensured that the operation proceeded smoothly. But as the men departed, leaving behind only subtle signs of observation, Vito knew that this was not an isolated incident. The eyes that had followed him, the whispers that had crept into his crew, the subtle warnings from Alden, they were all parts of a larger design. He understood, finally, that the shadows he had once controlled were now shaping his path. Every move, every choice, every action would be scrutinized, and any misstep could end everything he had built. In the days that followed, he withdrew further into strategy and contemplation. The city, with its music, lights, and endless movement, became a backdrop to a more intricate game. Vito moved silently, carefully, aware that even the slightest hesitation could signal weakness. He trusted no one completely, relied on no single ally entirely, and observed everything. And yet, despite the tension, he remained composed, his voice calm, his manner measured. The mask of normalcy, the exterior of the gangster who owned clubs and controlled docks, hid a man at the edge of an invisible precipice. And so, as winter deepened, Vito Caruso became a man shaped by shadows, moving through a world where loyalty and betrayal were indistinguishable. Each night brought new challenges, each encounter a test of judgment, and each silence a reminder that the edge was near. He had long lived with danger, but now the danger had become intimate, a presence that whispered constantly in the spaces around him, in the corners of the city, and in the quiet recesses of his mind. For Vito, the future was no longer a series of choices to be made. It was a maze of possibilities, each step weighted with consequence, each moment suspended in tension. He moved through the city with deliberate care, aware that the shadows he had once commanded were now guiding him toward an uncertain fate. And somewhere beyond the reach of his gaze, The forces that had once protected him watched, waiting, measuring, and deciding how this story would end. The city had changed since Vito Caruso first walked its streets as a boy, and he had changed even more. The familiar hum of life, the lights reflecting off wet asphalt, the faint echo of footsteps in alleys, these had once been the backdrop to a world he could navigate with ease. Now they were reminders of fragility, of the ever-present tension that underlay every movement, every conversation, every decision. The balance he had maintained for decades was beginning to tilt, and he could feel it in every quiet corner of the night. By the late 1950s, Vito's dual life had become more complex than he could have imagined. His clubs remained lively, his crew loyal yet cautious, and his name still carried weight in the underworld. But the network he had once served with careful discretion now demanded more than ever. Each mission was a test. Each request carried risks that stretched far beyond the familiar streets of New York. He delivered crates, facilitated silent transfers, and moved people across borders. But with each success, the weight on his shoulders grew heavier. He was no longer just a gangster. He was a man whose very life depended on invisible currents he could neither see nor control. It began subtly, as it always does. A shipment delayed. A contact in Havana who vanished without explanation. A coded message misread by someone he trusted. Small failures, almost imperceptible. But to the men who watched the world through shadows, mistakes were dangerous. Vito sensed the change immediately. The tightening of a web that had once been loose and flexible, but now seemed ready to snap. He understood that his usefulness could be measured, tested, and if it faltered, discarded. Despite the tension, Vito remained calm. He had learned the art of patience long ago, observing the movements of men, the rhythm of streets, and the way trust could be manipulated. Each night, he walked the city with quiet steps, noting faces in the crowd, gauging the direction of the wind, listening to the subtle murmur of water along the piers. He knew that survival depended not on force, but on perception, on understanding the invisible threads that connected one action to countless consequences. One evening, he received an unexpected visit from Alden. The man's expression was calm, but Vito recognized the weight behind his words. There had been reports of foreign interest in his operations, agents and contacts monitoring movements, observing details that should have remained unseen. Alden offered no comfort, only a warning. The game had shifted. Those who had once depended on him were now evaluating his loyalty, weighing whether he remained an asset or had become a liability. The message was clear. Vito Caruso, once untouchable, was now under scrutiny. His instincts told him that the shadow of betrayal was closer than ever, that the invisible hand guiding him had begun to question the value of its pawn. He spent long nights reviewing routes, memorizing schedules, and rehearsing contingencies in his mind. Every shipment, every meeting, every subtle signal had to be precise, flawless, or the consequences would be unforgiving. As the weeks passed, the tension around him grew more pronounced. Rivals in the underworld whispered again, hints of informants and silent betrayals circulating in dimly lit rooms. His crew sensed the change, but did not fully comprehend it. Some looked to him for reassurance, others for guidance, and a few silently questioned the decisions he made. Vito had learned long ago that suspicion, once planted, never fully dies. He moved carefully, dispensing favors and reassurances, managing both loyalty and fear with the same measured patience that had allowed him to rise through the years. Then came the final series of deliveries. They were unlike any he had coordinated before, complex, precise, and monitored by eyes he could not see. Ships moved at odd hours, codes changed without warning, and the men traveling with him were not those he had chosen. For the first time, Vito felt the pulse of true uncertainty. Every decision carried weight, every misstep could mean exposure, and every success felt fragile, like ice over deep water. He understood that his life was no longer entirely his own. During one particularly long night, he walked along the edge of the East River, the city lights reflecting across the surface, trembling and broken. The water whispered softly against the piers, carrying with it the quiet sense of inevitability. Vito thought of the boy he once was, of the immigrant family that had taught him survival through resilience, of the streets that had shaped his early years. He realized that the life he had chosen, the path he had walked, had led him to a place where escape was no longer a choice. It was a necessity. He began to prepare. Safe houses were secured, trusted crew members briefed in code, escape routes mapped with precision. He moved with quiet purpose, avoiding unnecessary exposure, blending into crowds and shadows alike. Every step was deliberate, every action calculated to preserve the illusion of normalcy, while preparing for the moment when discretion would be the only shield between him and catastrophe. The night of his disappearance arrived quietly, without fanfare. Ships departed, men moved under the cover of darkness, and the city seemed unaware of the momentous shift occurring along its waterfronts. Vito followed the routine one last time, overseeing a shipment that would carry more than goods. It would carry his fate. His movements were calm, measured, precise. Every detail accounted for, every risk calculated. As he stepped onto the dock, he noticed a small, inconspicuous boat tied loosely at the edge of the pier. The fog had thickened, obscuring the outlines of men and objects alike. He moved toward it, knowing instinctively that this was the point of no return. His crew had already departed, leaving him alone to complete the final steps. Alden's warning echoed in his mind. The line between asset and liability is thin, and the shadows never forget. The boat carried him quietly across the water, the city receding into fog and silence. For hours he remained calm, his mind rehearsing contingencies, monitoring movements, and measuring the distance between safety and exposure. He understood that once he crossed this threshold, his life as he had known it would end. The streets, the clubs, the familiar faces, everything would vanish like smoke curling upward from a dying flame. And then, almost imperceptibly, it happened. The city lights disappeared behind him, replaced by the black expanse of water and fog. The boat moved silently, and Vito felt the weight of decades of choices settle upon him. The double life, the delicate balance between gangster and spy, the careful dance between loyalty and betrayal, all converged in this single, quiet moment. He exhaled slowly, letting the tension drain from his shoulders, accepting that the world he had navigated with skill and patience was slipping beyond his grasp. When morning arrived, the city awoke as it always did, unaware of the man who had vanished into the shadows. No trace remained along the docks, no clue left behind. His crew waited, whispered, speculated, but none could say for certain where he had gone. Rumors spread quickly. Some said he had fled the country, others that he had been quietly removed, by forces he had once served. And yet, despite the speculation, the truth remained known to only a few, wrapped in secrecy and discretion, a final testament to the life he had led. In the days and years that followed, Vito Caruso became a name shrouded in mystery. Intelligence files, when they existed, recorded him as unknown or unaccounted for. Gangsters whispered his story in hushed tones, sometimes admiring, sometimes warning. And in the quiet corners of the city, where fog drifted along empty streets and the hum of life softened in the night, his legend endured. A man who lived between loyalty and betrayal, who vanished into the shadows with the same quiet precision that had defined every step of his extraordinary life. The city did not pause for grief or curiosity. Life pressed on, indifferent to the quiet vanishings and hidden bargains that had once shaped its streets. In the days following Vito Caruso's disappearance, his clubs continued to hum with music and laughter. His docks moved goods as always. But there was a subtle emptiness, a silence where his presence had once held sway. Men who had once relied on his guidance now looked over their shoulders more carefully, sensing that the safety they had taken for granted was no longer guaranteed. Rumors spread quickly. In smoky back rooms, whispered conversations floated through the air. Some said Vito had fled the country under the cover of fog and night, taking with him secrets that could topple governments. Others suggested that he had been quietly extracted by the intelligence agencies he had served, whisked away to a life hidden from the world he had once navigated. Few dared to speculate aloud, for even mention his name now felt like invoking a ghost. The intelligence world was equally restless. Those who had once relied on Vito's discretion found themselves questioning every detail. Files were pulled, contacts were cross-checked, and quiet inquiries were made into his movements prior to that final night. Yet even with their networks, they found no trace. It was as though he had dissolved into the fog that had carried him away, leaving only echoes of his existence. Meanwhile, the underworld felt the absence keenly. Rival gangsters, who had once feared his reach and cunning, cautiously probed the territories he had controlled. Some sought to claim what they thought he had abandoned. Others simply waited, uncertain whether his disappearance signaled vulnerability or a trap. Vito's crew, loyal yet anxious, held together as best they could, but the sense of direction, the guiding hand that had orchestrated their operations with calm authority, was gone. In those quiet corners where the city breathed slowly, stories of Vito's exploits became legend. He was described as a man who walked between worlds, a bridge between criminal enterprise and shadowy intelligence networks. Tales were told of shipments that arrived unseen, deals that concluded without violence, and of a calm, calculating presence that had once commanded attention without ever raising a voice. These stories, retold in hushed tones, shaped the way men understood loyalty, power, and discretion. For some, Vito became more than a man. He was a symbol of control, of patience, of the possibility that a single individual could navigate the chaos of the world and survive. His methods were studied quietly, lessons extracted from memory and conjecture, even as the reality of his disappearance reminded everyone that no one, no matter how skilled, could ever fully master the shadows. Among intelligence circles, the mystery deepened. Files labeled Caruso, Vito were circulated in restricted offices, marked with with annotations like unverified and unknown status. Analysts debated whether he had been eliminated, extracted, or merely gone into hiding. The lack of evidence created tension and fascination in equal measure. Every intercepted communication, every suspicious disappearance, every rumor of clandestine activity sparked a connection in their minds, back to the man who had once walked the docks with quiet authority. Yet despite the attention, nothing concrete emerged. No trace of his movements was ever confirmed. The fog that had carried him across the river seemed to have swallowed him entirely. Those who had worked closely with him, trusted contacts in both the criminal and intelligence worlds, could only rely on intuition, memory, and the few coded messages he had left behind. Even these were ambiguous, careful to protect both the sender and the receiver. Vito's disappearance had become a study in invisibility, a final lesson in the art of moving without leaving evidence. Life in the city adapted. The docks continued their work. The clubs remained vibrant, and the rhythm of New York pushed forward. But a subtle reverence lingered in the spaces Vito had once occupied. Men who had known him, who had followed his instructions, and learned from his calm authority, carried his methods in their habits. His crew, though smaller and more cautious, operated with the precision he had instilled. Rivals, wary of hidden traps or retribution, approached with care. Even the agencies that had monitored him learned to respect the possibility that he had anticipated every angle, every threat, every contingency. The legend of Vito Caruso spread beyond New York. In Havana, whispers of a man who had navigated complex routes with silent expertise reached ears who had never met him. Overseas contacts spoke of a figure who seemed always one step ahead, who delivered information and people with unmatched discretion. The story blurred the lines between fact and myth. Some claimed to have seen him in far-off ports, orchestrating operations with the same calm efficiency as before. Others suggested he had vanished entirely, leaving only the systems he had influence behind. Despite the uncertainty, Vito's influence endured. Men continued to rely on the networks he had built, using the paths he had charted and the methods he had taught. Deals that might have failed in chaos continued to succeed quietly. Conflicts were avoided, messages delivered without fanfare, and operations completed without detection. It was as if he had imbued the city itself with his caution, leaving traces of strategy in the way streets were navigated, docks were organized, and alliances maintained. And yet, there was always the underlying tension, the unspoken acknowledgement that the man who had once walked among them was no longer present. His absence created both opportunity and fear. Those who sought power moved cautiously, aware that the balance he had maintained could not be replicated without careful attention. Others, haunted by the thought of an unseen oversight, hesitated in their ambitions. The streets and piers, vibrant and chaotic, still bore the imprint of his calm authority, a shadow stretching across every corner. In quiet moments, some wondered whether he had truly vanished. Could a man with such understanding of networks, timing, and loyalty simply disappear? Or had he stepped into a role even more concealed, one beyond the reach of ordinary observation? The ambiguity itself became part of his legend. He was everywhere and nowhere, a ghost of influence that continued to shape events without appearing in them. Even in the intelligence world, analysts and agents continued to speculate. Files were re-examined, reports compared, patterns traced. Occasionally, a small success or unusual occurrence in the city or overseas would spark a note. Possible Caruso involvement. Nothing could be confirmed, but the possibility was enough to keep his name alive in conversations that were otherwise cautious and discreet. Meanwhile, in the underworld, whispers of loyalty, discretion, and silent authority spread. Stories of how he managed his crew, navigated rivalries, and maintained discretion became lessons for the next generation of operators. His methods were imitated, his style revered, even as the man himself remained absent. The balance he had maintained, a world where loyalty and subtle influence guided events more than brute force, continued to influence those who survived in the same circles. Years passed, and the city evolved, but Vito Caruso's presence lingered in the memory of those who had known him and the stories that had grown in his absence. Men spoke of him with a mixture of respect and caution, aware that the skills and patience he had demonstrated were unmatched. They knew that wherever he had gone, he had left a legacy of calm authority, careful planning, and untraceable influence. A reminder that true power often exists, not in visible control, but in quiet mastery of the unseen. And so, the story of Vito Caruso closed not with violence, not with revelation, but with enduring mystery. His life, entwined with both crime and intelligence, ended in disappearance, leaving behind a city, a world, and a network forever marked by his shadow. He had lived in a world of double lives, of whispered negotiations and hidden corridors, and in the end, he had stepped beyond their reach, leaving only the echoes of a shadow that would endure for generations. The city carried on, vibrant and restless, as if nothing had changed. But those who understood, those who had watched, learned, and followed, knew the truth. Some men leave a mark not by the lives they take, but by the balance they create and the silence they command. And in the quiet corners of the night, in the whispers along the docks, and in the unseen channels of power, the shadow of Vito Caruso remained, unseen, untouchable, and eternal. And so, as the city hums quietly in the background, and the last echoes of Vito Caruso's story drift softly through your mind, we come to the end of this journey. The docks, the clubs, the silent exchanges, the shadowed streets, they are all still there, waiting, moving, breathing, as if nothing has changed. But we know from these stories that even in the quietest corners, secrets linger, and the shadows hold memories of those who move between worlds with careful precision. Vito's story reminds us that life is often more complex than it seems. Choices, loyalty, and silence. Sometimes they carry more weight than power or wealth. And though the man himself has vanished into the fog of legend, his influence remains, stretching across streets, oceans, and the whispers of those who knew him. As you rest, let your thoughts drift with the gentle rhythm of the city at night. Let the music of distant footsteps, the subtle hum of water against the pier, and the quiet breath of the streets carry you deeper into calm. The streets may be restless, the world always moving, but here, in this moment, you are safe. If you've enjoyed this journey through the shadows, the streets, and the hidden corners of a world few ever see, don't forget to subscribe and stay with us for more stories like this. Stories that drift through mystery, suspense, and quiet intrigue, perfect for nights of calm and relaxation. Close your eyes, breathe slowly, and let the echoes of Vito Caruso's story fade gently into the night. The city is alive, but for now, you are at peace. And perhaps, somewhere in the shadows, he watches too, silent, unseen, and eternal.